Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. We all know the industrial sector continues to be a hot target for hackers. Ransomware, malware, and phishing attacks all continue to escalate in both frequency and potency. And as we've discussed before, industrial control systems continue to provide a significant number of vulnerabilities for the black hats to exploit. The ongoing mixture of new technologies with legacy systems invites attention, and the reality is that it continues to pay dividends for hackers and ransomware groups. However, as we've also discussed, there are solutions, one of which is to work with good guys who can think like the bad guys. In doing so, these organizations perform penetration testing to help identify potential vulnerabilities throughout the organization. These companies can then help manufacturers identify weak security practices, fortify access points, and mitigate vulnerabilities. Our guest today can personally attest to the impact penetration testing has had for some of the world's largest manufacturers. Before we talk to our guest for this episode, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Rockwell Automation. For more information on their cybersecurity solutions, you can go to rockwellautomation.com. It's now my pleasure to welcome Andra Zaharia, Head of Content and Community at pentesttools.com, a global provider of penetration testing services and solutions. Andra, thanks so much for joining us today. Maybe to kind of get things going, you can talk a little bit about some of the things that Pentest does and why there's such a growing need for these types of services right now.
Of course. First of all, lovely to be here. Thank you for extending the invitation, and thank you for the great podcast that you're putting together, bringing all these specialists from so many disciplines of cybersecurity together. I feel that you really highlight the diversity and just the rich experiences that people have in this industry, and that's something that I love. It's actually my favorite thing about it.
Appreciate it. Thank
you. To your question. Pentesttools.com brings together 20 plus tools that penetration testers need. Most of them are custom made, and it basically connects them in a workflow that serves penetration testers in terms of optimizing their flow, in terms of cutting waiting time and other tedious repetitive tasks, so they can actually focus on the most important part, which is the creative hacking part, the part that no tool and no technology can automate because it's uniquely human, and it is just very unique to each person and each specialist. That's something that I believe in. That's something the entire team believes in. And kind of this guiding principle really kind of makes us strive to always put the specialist first and truly understand how to use products, how to use technology, and what they actually need. Because one of the changes that I've seen in the industry in the past 3 to 5 years is a stronger focus on offensive security. And we can see this in the fact that there are now mainstream news about ethical hackers, the fact that there's a bit more nuance in how we describe ethical hacking versus hacker as a generally negative term, which I think doesn't really help our industry. Plus, just companies being a lot more open to getting this attacker's perspective, not just as a compliance check, but as an actual way of understanding and gaining self-awareness, I guess, in terms of what they need to fix and how things look like on the outside.
Excellent. I think penetration testing is something that we have a vague familiarity with. We think we know what it is, but maybe you can go into a little bit more detail in terms of what are some of the things that you really look to understand better or derive from some of this penetration testing that's done.
I'd love to, especially because the confusion you mentioned tends to persist. There are various aspects behind this, but let's tackle the clarity part first. So what penetration testing is actually trying to exploit the vulnerabilities that you find. Vulnerability assessment, that's one thing. That's the first part of the engagement, along with OSINT and, of course, other types of research that you do into your target. But the penetration testing part is actually, okay, we've found these potential vulnerabilities, we've found these exposed assets, we found this code injection into this web app. Let's try to see if we can actually exploit them, if we can actually prove the risk, if the risk is real, if the risk is important to the business context, if this high risk vulnerability is actually present in critical infrastructure, or if it's just in some old forgotten server that no one cares about that stores no important information. And this type of decision making, this type of context, just this type of adding context around threats, around vulnerabilities, this is something that is very complex work. It takes a lot of critical thinking. It takes a lot of experience with similar systems, and it takes a deep understanding of the business context. That's why no two penetration tests are alike. And this is why I think that we've seen a massive improvement in the professionalism associated with these types of services, which in the past have generally not have had, they haven't had the best reputation, because unfortunately, some so-called pen testers just chose to give their clients vulnerability assessment reports that tools put out, which is, again, that's not penetration testing. But I see a massive improvement in this, especially because pen testers and ethical hackers in general are becoming a lot more vocal, and they're becoming more prominent in their communities, in the cybersecurity community, in the technology community, and they're speaking more about their work, how their work happens, how it influences security programs. Because at the end of the day, offensive security actually drives the entire security industry forward. It's where it's let's say the niche or the segment where specialists discover new vulnerabilities, they develop exploit codes, they do proof of concepts. That's those activities push and the entire, let's say, the entire security ecosystem for stronger security, to patch these vulnerabilities, to mitigate them, and to make sure that we also learn from these processes so we can apply these lessons in the future.
No, I think a couple of great points there. First, the last thing you said was about learning from, and I think that's the biggest benefit potentially of this penetration testing, is to learn and understand as we go, because it's constantly evolving. Cybersecurity is constantly changing. The bad guys are getting smarter, all that. I think you also made a great point there about creative hacking and the ethical side of it and the benefits that can emanate from it. It helps reinforce the fact that this is a complex adversary potentially, and we need creative problem solving on the offensive side to really go after and develop good solutions. So interesting points there. I've got to ask, in your experience in doing some of this penetration testing, have there been some unique things that you've discovered or found out that really sort of stick out in your mind, or as experiences and things that you can take forward?
Given that, let's say, most of the work, of course, all of the work is confidential, but I think that there are some key lessons that we can look at. And I say this from the experience of watching my colleagues, of working to understand their workflows, and trying to capture all of that, really the technical depth, all of those details that give you those aha moments, and help you understand, oh, this is how things work. So one of the things that I've seen is that you have to be really relentless and persistent and very, very patient when you're trying to exploit a vulnerability that you found and that you're certain is there. The second thing is that you need to have a really, really well thought out workflow if you're going to make the most of your time. And I know this sounds like common knowledge, but it's actually a lot more complicated than that, like all simple things. All of the simple things have this incredibly layered depth to them. And this particular thing about workflows is something that I've seen firsthand in the ethical hacking courses I've done. I've seen how long it takes for someone to actually achieve what they set out to do. Sometimes it can happen. You can get lucky in Pentest and find something that's, like a low-hanging fruit. But that's not always the case. And what I mean by this is that, for example, the most, let's say, committed companies are to security and to penetration testing are in the financial industry, insurers, banks, and so on. They do this obviously because they're compelled by compliance regulations, but also because they safeguard so much important data. And of course, they're also the safest. We don't really hear about banks getting hacked. Thank God for that. So again, it takes a lot of resilience to go through all of these stages, to not give up, to really cultivate the ability to go further and to think more creatively, which is why this is a really demanding job.
A couple of great points there too, Andra. I like how you talk about workflow because in the industrial sector, that's something we can understand. You know, we're production driven, we're process focused. So setting up these penetration testings and having sort of a logical workflow in place to helping them flow more efficiently, that makes a ton of sense, and it's a good thing to keep in mind in setting these tests up. The other thing, I think I like how you're talking about the fact that these are more complex. The ethical side of it is also needs to be a complex process to combat the complexity of the adversary. Cybersecurity and more advanced strategies in the industrial sector for cybersecurity is really in its infancy. This is something we haven't been thinking about for as long as we should have. So to continue to reinforce the fact that this is not a simple fix, but it is something that there are things we can do to help prevent a lot of these attacks that are going on. I think it's an important point. Again, sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that I see penetration testers and ethical hackers as guides. They can offer a very strong, very condensed and fast education to organizations who are really interested in diving into these aspects. I feel that these types of conversations around this topic, not security in general, but security from the perspective of an attacker, are really interesting because they really make people feel what it means to be just scrutinized, and what it means to have your infrastructure canvassed for just all the vulnerabilities that it has, and to really have that emotional resonance with this fact, because that's what drives decision making. We like to think of ourselves as very rational beings, but at the end of the day, emotions actually play an essential part in decision making, and it's not until you feel those potential risks that you're able to act proactively. And there are plenty of industries and segments that are in the same situation that need to do this kind of work and that are slowly engaging. And the fact that ethical hackers have been, let's say, upgraded from the, let's say, hoodie wearing type in a basement to people who are actually in all sorts of roles. They're in boardrooms, they're in C-level meetings, they're everywhere. The fact that we're changing the narrative around ethical hacking and that we're bringing this to light and not just keeping it obscured, I think that that's a very important step forward for everyone.
You know, again, with industrial cybersecurity still being in really its beginning stages for especially a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises, maybe you could walk us through what does a penetration test look like? How does it function? How does it flow?
There are three ways in which you can have a penetration test done. First is the black box penetration test, which means that you basically give someone your website or whatever you want tested, but without telling them anything. So that gives you the full perspective of a potential attacker who has no inside information and just comes at you from the outside. That's a very interesting type of engagement. It's a very challenging one. And it can also bring great results. The second type is the white box penetration testing, which means that you give penetration testers full access to your company, including types of applications, roles, where your different assets are, network configuration, and so on. The point of this approach is to actually speed up the entire process, because instead of taking time to map all of the infrastructure, they can go in depth from the first day, and they can start identifying misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, and exposures without having to first kind of understand the entire ecosystem of the company itself. And of course, there's also the gray box approach, which is a combination of both. So you give penetration testers limited access. And the usual phases of a penetration test involved reconnaissance, which is also attack surface mapping, which means identifying things such as subdomains, such as network assets, servers, technologies that sit on those servers, identifying potentially exposed data, such as confidential files or credentials that are published on GitHub and code repositories, which still happens, unfortunately, and a lot of other things. Then you would go on to vulnerability scanning. With that knowledge of the attack surface, you would go to find and see which assets are the most vulnerable, obviously, which are outdated, which are misconfigured, which have high-risk CVEs in them. And then you would go on to exploiting these vulnerabilities, proving the risk, extracting information, taking screenshots of the affected targets. So anything that you can actually prove that an attacker could access. And you don't just deliver risk descriptions, so what the risk is and how it works and steps to reproduce it, but also recommendations for fixing that. And this entire cycle is not just something you do and stop. Of course, after fixing the issues that the pen testers found, you usually do a retest to make sure that the fixes actually worked and that the majority or the most important and the prioritized issues were fixed. So having this process done on a continuous base, that's something ideal. Obviously, not all companies can do that, but what I've seen from the experience of my colleagues is that the most diligent companies who actually work on implementing these steps, when they do regular pen tests and retests, there's barely anything there to fix because they've already worked on their stuff. And that's encouraging to them. That's very satisfying for us as well. And everyone can see that they're actually evolving their security and that the results are there. And it's the same with using Pentest tools, for example. So applying this service mentality to how the workflow works, when you can see that you've fixed these vulnerabilities and the next scan delivers good results, that the attack surface is shrinking, that is a great feeling, honestly, to have. And it's also something that business leaders can understand easily because they can just see that we had these problems, that would be the potential business impact, and now we've mitigated that. And obviously that can also be a way to attract a higher budget for security, which can be a really challenging thing, especially when there's a potential recession or talks around that in every other industry.
Yeah, I think when you talk about budgetary challenges for cybersecurity, you are definitely preaching to the choir here, and for a lot of our listeners and viewers. So definitely appreciate that. You know, in the industrial sector, we've got the IT side and the OT side, and ideally, these two are talking to each other. But there's definitely a lot of situations where they're sort of siloed, and the communication is just not happening the way we would like it to. From a penetration tester's perspective, is it better to try to do this process going at the enterprise all at once, or do you block it down a little bit and do let's penetration test the IT side, let's penetration test the OT side, or do you look at it as let's just penetration test the whole company, the whole operation?
I think it really depends on the appetite of the company itself. So if they're willing to, if they're just, let's say, starting out to do this, and they want to do kind of a test project or a proof of concept that this actually works for them, and that they have the resources to implement the fixes, the recommended fixes, because that's also a big challenge for some companies. I think that you can definitely start with a smaller project and focus just on IT, reap the benefits there, prove the viability, prove that the team can handle, fixing all of the issues that pen testers identified, and then move to the OT part, and perhaps then also see the connections between these two segments and see how they work together and see those business logic flaws, which are one of the most interesting things that you can discover through a penetration test.
You know, I think whenever we talk about this type of testing from the industrial side, there's a couple of things that come up that just make it hard for them to always say, yeah, we can definitely do this, even though they see the benefits. There's obvious benefits to doing all this. But I think one of them is potentially ceasing operations or shutting down for a little bit or stopping in order to have this penetration testing take place. Time literally is money in manufacturing. So stopping the lines or shutting things down is very, very difficult to do and potentially could have a negative impact on the organization. What's your advice there sort of in coming realizing that we do have to do this type of stuff and also confronting some of the arguments against it, I guess you could say.
I think that's the kind of the one of the top 3 fears that people have with penetration tests. Like, are you going to bring down my website? Are you going to bring down my server, my production server? Skilled penetration testers will be extra careful not to disrupt operations. Of course, that can still happen. It's still a risk. It's in the statement of work. I mean, it's in the contract. That can actually happen. But with experienced people, they know how far to push the network and the resources. They will know that if ideally you want a penetration test done on a live infrastructure, so you want to do this as an attacker would, because some companies prefer to have penetration tests done over a replica of their production environment, which isn't great because it's not the same. Obviously, it doesn't have the same level of interaction, the same usage patterns, and so on and so forth. So there is this option that's a bit less effective, but there is the option to do this without endangering your production environment in any way. So anything that's live. But again, it really takes working with people who are very conscious of the business needs to know how far to push and to make sure that they're not putting you out of business. And of course, this is an entirely different approach compared to when an attacker would go full throttle on anything just to, make the money that they would get from extorting you, from infecting the infrastructure with ransomware and so on. I mean, I still have a very vivid picture in my mind of the chaos that ensued after WannaCry, when companies shut down, when car manufacturers had to halt production, and when all of the world basically just went into full panic mode about this thing that was taking over without seemingly impossible to stop. And obviously it's not been the only, that was just a start. But also I think that it's important to go back to those lessons and to understand that it's not the same type of approach. It's not as aggressive. And you can discuss and negotiate how far you want the penetration testers to go. If there are things that you don't want touched, they won't touch them. This is a business agreement. This is an ethical hacking agreement. So you have a lot more control over these things than you might think generally without knowing the depths of the activity itself.
Yeah. Is that frustrating for you when you're working with a company and they're like, yeah, we don't want to go in this far. Just try to, penetration test these certain pieces because these will know we're okay. I mean, is that frustrating for you because you can probably see other vulnerabilities that are just not being addressed at that point?
It can be sometimes, but at the same time, doing something is better than doing nothing. So the idea that every little bit helps is actually very true. In an ecosystem so large as the tech ecosystem and our incredible reliance on it, actually, in this context, we can actually make a big difference by doing small things really well. Even if that is a limited penetration test, even if that is patching a certain vulnerability, every little bit really truly helps, and there's a compound effect to all of these things. So in my opinion, yes, it can be frustrating, but at the same time, if that interaction goes well, if the company learns to trust the penetration testers they work with because there's good communication, because there's a professional report, that opens the door to doing a lot more things. And at the end of the day, again, it's all about trust. It's all about professionalism, transparency, and the best penetration testers I know really take the time to educate customers. They take the time to explain. They're patient. They have good communication skills. They show up and they create this kind of safe space for people to learn without making them feel bad because they don't have the technical know-how to understand certain things. And to me, that is the first step in establishing a long-lasting relationship, into helping people, again, have a positive, empowering experience with cybersecurity.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up about the technical know-how and having that in-house, because I think that is another potential obstacle for a lot of industrial enterprises doing this penetration testing. Right now, we have a huge skills gap concern throughout manufacturing. And from the OT cybersecurity perspective, it's especially really tough right now to find that type of expertise. So how would you maybe overcome that challenge a little bit when somebody says, it's great, you're going to do this testing, you're going to give us all this feedback. We don't know how to handle this information internally. We just don't have the expertise. What's your advice there?
There are opportunities to have, let's say, a penetration tester guide implementation with the team. So there are various ways in which you can collaborate with pen testers, not just throughout the testing process itself, but also after it. So there is that option. There is the option of asking them for help to connect you to people in their ecosystem in terms of developers, freelancers that do specific types of work, so they can come in and help you learn how to do those things. Because at the end of the day, it's the teach a man how to fish type of situation. Just having someone give you that expertise directly is a great way of doing this, rather than taking months or years to develop that expertise internally. And one of the things that's really interesting about the cybersecurity industry, and I learned this from someone, is that although there is incredible competition in this industry in terms of products and services and competency and so on, there's also incredible collaboration. There's also people sharing their processes, their workflows, their cheat sheets, their methods, everything, their proof of concepts, and doing this in public, because better security for one company is better security for everyone, including companies big and small do this. But again, just going through all of that depth and that huge volume of information usually takes someone with experience. So if you can have a couple of conversations with people, have someone train your team, that can be a big leap forward. And you can actually also probably maybe improve job satisfaction for existing staff, because they get to learn something new, because they get to add to their skill set, and because they get to feel that they're making an important contribution to their company. So there are ways, and there's a lot more flexibility, I think, that people realize there is. And I think that's important to highlight.
Yeah, and I don't want to gloss over kind of what you said about something is better than nothing, because if there was nothing in place, you were completely exposed, even if it is a gradual process. We know that the threat actors are getting smarter and more complex, so if you can at least start thwarting some of those attacks or making it a little more difficult, you're in a better position. And there is a lot to be said for that, I think. There is a potential for somebody to put their head in the sand because it's just too big of a problem to potentially deal with. Any little thing that you're doing is an improvement, and an exponential one really at that. Andra, you brought up a lot of different threat vulnerabilities that can be brought to the attention of the enterprise through this penetration testing. We're hearing a bunch of new threat actors that are out there. They're growing. There's more of them. Are there any particular groups or attacks that are kind of on your radar screen that you've seen as either more prominent or more dangerous potentially for the industrial sector?
I think that one of the, let's say, types of illegal activities in terms of hacking is settling access to breached companies. So these type of malicious actors, that's all they do. They find vulnerabilities, they break in, they achieve persistence in the system, and then they sell that access to other types of ransomware groups and other, let's say, cyber criminal groups in general. So I think that is one of the things to be really on the lookout for, simply because access is now the most targeted thing. It's not just stealing data, it's being able to achieve that persistency without being undetected. And I think that that's everyone's worst nightmare, to have a threat actor in your network and not know about it, because you can't find them, because you don't know what your attack surface is, because you don't have a list of all your assets, because basically you have blind spots in your infrastructure and you don't know what those are. And so anyone can actually profit from that if they really set their mind to it. So direct access brokers, because that's what they're called, are definitely one of the key things to look out for, to understand how they operate, because that gives you a good idea of how other attackers would go on to try to compromise your network. And it's important to see that there's been a lot of specialization in the past 7 years in cyber criminal operations. Cyber criminal groups have split up into these very specific malicious activities, such as, again, selling access, developing certain types of ransomware, and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely, let's say, mounting pressure, but I think it's really also important to look at the good things that are happening in the industry, because that's where we get the energy from to invest it in tackling this kind of never-ending list of challenges, and looking on the positive side, seeing how things are progressing, seeing how, let's say, security standards become embedded into all types of services that most people use. I think that's a really important thing to acknowledge and to be proud of at the end of the day.
So are there any particular strategies that you advocate or champion? I mean, we have a lot of people talking about double-factor authentication for login or multi-factor, zero trust. Are all of it part of is it all in the mix, or is there one particular approach that you've seen either be more effective or that you sort of advocate when working with companies?
Frameworks are definitely very helpful to try to organize your efforts, to try to coordinate them, to try to find ways how to apply your budget and resources, your team's expertise, and so on. But where let's say, the biggest pitfalls show up is in the very mundane stuff, the very standard stuff, things like misconfiguration, things like outdated software. The key problems that penetration testers still find are not extremely advanced, really complicated exploits. Of course, that can happen as well, but most are kind of basic things. And these types of issues emerge because there's a huge proliferation of technology. The pace at which companies are shipping products, technology, the dynamic and the expansion of the IT ecosystem is so much faster than security is able to keep up with. So there's always going to be this kind of catching up, let's say, type of approach to security versus technology in general. And no matter how important these frameworks are, and they definitely are, the basics are still the things that actually make the biggest difference. Correct implementation, making sure that security products are well configured and that someone actually uses them. And this is something that I really appreciate, for example, from Jenny Radcliffe, the people hacker, says this in her book, and she's been advocating for this, and many people have said this, is that the only good security is security people actually use. Whether we're talking about products or services, you can have the fanciest, most interesting acronym in your infrastructure in terms of security technology, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be effective unless someone is committed to using it, to maxing it out, to maintaining it, and to pushing that information further to colleagues and teams so they can act on it. So again, we're back to the essential: good communication, openness, collaboration, and just having that personal alignment with cybersecurity work and what it takes, which is not something that anyone can do, not something that everyone can do, because it's quite intense.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it's interesting from your perspective, and you mentioned it earlier in the interview, talking about the confidentiality that you have with customers, and that's obviously a given in the work that you're doing. But I've long contended that the things that we uncover through penetration testing or in response to hacks and attacks, a lot of that information would be beneficial to share across the board, whether it's within an industry or just throughout the security professional atmosphere or environment, if you will, universe. What are your thoughts there on just having more transparency within cybersecurity about the vulnerabilities, about some of these attacks, other than just, there's a patch for it?
I think that there's been an increase in that as well. I know situations where customers were open to disclosing how the process worked for them and the results that they got after a time period that they felt is safe for them to actually share this information. I've seen companies who have internal penetration testing teams and internal security teams disclose their incidents so others can learn from it. There was a couple of months ago, Coinbase suffered a breach. And they actually communicated that really well. They explained how it originated. They commended the person who reported that they had gotten compromised without finger pointing and without blaming. It was the only write-up, kind of the only disclosure that did not mention the human is the weakest link, and they really appreciated that. That was really, really great to see. Yeah. Then there was the Reddit hack where they did something similar. They also hosted an AMA on Reddit about the breach and everything that had happened. And their communication was great up to the point where they mentioned that, as you know, humans are the weakest link, which again has never helped anyone. You don't call people incompetent. Yeah, exactly. But I think that there is an increase in communication and in sharing. Of course, it can always be better, but I think these examples really help others get more comfortable with sharing their experience and realizing, hopefully we're over the narrative that no one can ever be compromised. I really hope so, because it was never realistic. It was never real.
Absolutely. Andra, this has been great. Really appreciate all the time and expertise you shared here. Before we wrap up, just got to ask, when we look forward the next 12 to 18 months, are there any particular cybersecurity issues that you feel are going to really come to the forefront or be more prominent as we address some either ongoing attacks or just continuing challenges that arise?
Again, this is going to sound very unsexy and very unappealing, but when we look at the top 10 vulnerabilities of 2022, we can see that, first of all, some of them have been around for years, and they persist in the ecosystem. So they're probably going to be, like 90% of them are going to be in the top 10 problems that people have this year as well, and probably the next year too. And I can mention Spring for Shell, which has actually recently had a resurgence. And there was a specific ransomware group targeting this vulnerability. We have Log4Shell, which was a huge deal in December 2021, and now we're over 1 year later, and it's still a massive issue simply because of its prevalence and ease of exploitation. So these simple, again, they're not necessarily simple things, but they're persistent things. It's one of the things that I've actually learned from Stoicism is to look at the things that don't change, because those are usually the biggest problems that we have left to solve. Not the new shiny thing, but the things that are still there and we haven't figured out how to solve them effectively and faster. And making progress in those is a lot more important than protecting against APT groups that usually target different kind of infrastructure. That doesn't mean that it can't happen. But again, looking to the basics and doing the basic things right, or looking at those recurring problems can yield a bigger benefit than trying to tackle all of these new things that come up, which is always going to be the case.
No, it makes sense. I always talk about blocking and tackling, and it seems to apply for cybersecurity as well. Start with the basics. Now, Andra, you have your own cybersecurity podcast as well. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and where people can check that out.
I appreciate you giving me a chance to talk about this. It is a passion project. It's called Cyber Empathy. And my goal with it is to actually bring out the stories of the people who work in cybersecurity and show people in the industry and outside the industry that information security specialists are just incredibly kind, generous, and very personally committed to this space. Because when I usually talk about cybersecurity to people outside the industry, I always tell them there are these amazing people in this industry, and it's actually technology is just a sliver of it. Because obviously people make technology, they operate technology, they implement it, they improve it. And it's people driven. It's not technology driven. And obviously that raises a lot of eyebrows and always gets, it's a good conversation starter. So I thought I'd turn that into something that more people into the industry can use. I try to bring out, and my guests are very generous with that, I try to bring out examples, practical examples of how we can use empathy in building products, in building relationships, in giving people these positive experiences with cybersecurity, and in elevating our understanding of human psychology and how that influences not just how we build security software, but also how we use security software. And simply making use of all of that incredible research into neuropsychology, psychology, sociology, and a lot of other disciplines that end with ology, and bring all of those rich insights into cybersecurity. As one of my guests said, we've spent 20 years developing technology, and we've solved the bulk of the problems in the space. Now it's time to focus on the people and invest just as much in empowering them and helping them understand how to leverage everything they have, how to just build safer processes, and how to elevate and evolve their own expertise and skill set around technology, even if they're not in this industry. So yeah, I hope that it helps inspire people and give them a good feeling about interacting with cybersecurity.
Thanks, Andra. And for more information on the work Andra and her colleagues do, you can get more information at Pentest, that's Pentest-tools.com. Thanks for joining us today. To catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Andra Zaharia, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.